Let's start off the evening. This has been a remarkably, not difficult, but we just had to kind of go ad hoc with Don's illness. You unfortunate people have seen me hosting and moderating a couple times, and we also had others that stood at the podium and so forth. But our leader is Don, and we're all inspired by the man. And as the old saying goes, that heavy work is made light by many hands. And there's a lot of people behind the scenes that have really, really stepped up this year in Don's absence. And I was talking to Don this afternoon, and I said he is the ambassador of Minnesota. He is the shuttle driver. He is the Uber driver. He is the organizer of our dinners and our things in Don's absence. And I would like to recognize to the audience, Mr. Steve Anderson has gone way above and beyond helping us make this year function. So I know he's standing up in the back. Many of you know Steve from behind the bookshelf. There he is up there. Let's give a hand to Stephen. Thank you very much, Stephen, for all your hard work and for everybody that's really stepped up this year. That's what makes this program so great is we have good people in good positions, and obviously we take our cue and our leadership from Don. So we're going to wish him the best of health and hope that he'll return to us very soon. So let's move forward with the program. We have I'm really anxious about our MC here tonight. I've just kind of casually known Joe since my involvement with the World War II Roundtable over the last couple of years, and he's just a very eloquent gentleman and a very, very smart man. He's going to be hosting the evening here, and let me just give you a quick background on Joe. Dr. Joe Fitzharris got his BA at the University of St. Thomas, where I have a daughter going to right now. Can you do something about the price? God, man, the heck is that? He got his BA in history at the University of St. Thomas and his master's degree from the University of Minnesota, and then went on for further studies while also working as an instructor at the University of St. Thomas, and finally reached the accolade of a PhD from the University of Wisconsin. He was teaching at St. Thomas, and I guess they kind of liked the guy. So they asked him to become a professor, and Joe enjoyed a very, very wonderful career of almost 40 years as an instructor at the University of St. Thomas, and for his service and for his professionalism, his knowledge, and his teaching, he was given the auspicious honor of being Professor Emeritus. They just don't hand those things out. Not only is Joe a very integral part of the World War II Roundtable, he's kind of one of those guys that's a man behind the curtain, along with Dr. Connie Harris, the round tablets that are so skillfully written and researched every month. That's Joe and Connie that do that for us. And it's always great to show up a little bit early, take a seat, read this wonderful short little dissertation about the program, and his knowledge is immense. But not only is Joe immersed in World War II history, he's also very, very has a very, very large interest in the Civil War. And he is a very integral member of the Twin City Civil War Roundtable. And his very highly critically acclaimed book, The Hardest Lot of Men, just recently came out, which is the harrowing story of the 3rd Minnesota Infantry in the Civil War, which it's amazing what these guys and their contributions to the winning of the Civil War. Along with that, Joe is just a wonderful guy that is always here and is always an integral part of the World War II Roundtable. So it's really an honor and a pleasure to have him stand at the stage. So would you give him a warm welcome to Mr. Joe Fitzharris. Thank you.
Mark says that was the $20 introduction. He's going to have to take a credit card. And just to clarify, Connie writes the round tablet. I edit it and occasionally critique it. And then we turn it over to the peanut gallery, and everybody else gets to chime in. Tonight, our first speaker, our author, is Bonnie Gilbert. Bonnie teaches at North Idaho College in Coeur d'Alene, which is, for those of you who are interested in World War II naval, just down the road from where the Farragut Naval Training Station was located. She took her MA in Oregon, and she's been making very good use of her skills ever since. Her father and her grandfather were both civilian contractors, as Axel alluded to, who were working for the Navy on Wake Island when the Japanese paid a visit. They spent the rest of the war as prisoners of war, which raises really interesting questions about the laws of war, in that they fought and they weren't part of an organized military unit, they weren't uniformed, and they fall into that ambiguous, they're not guerrillas, they're not soldiers, and they're certainly something other than civilians. It gets interesting, and thankfully the Japanese didn't care one whit about international law or the laws of war. I don't know that it would have made a difference if they did. Anyway, her book, Building for War, is about those contractors, like her father and grandfather, about their resistance alongside the Marines, and then they're going into captivity. Some of them staying on Wake, only to be slaughtered. And by the way, the order from Tokyo that ordered their slaughtering was, in typical Japanese fashion, very indirect, and if you didn't understand Japanese culture, it would sound like they were talking about cultivating flowers. The joys of being for those of you who wonder why we had trouble reading Japanese radio messages, you first have to decode them, and then you have to figure out what they're actually saying. Two very different things. The rest of the contractors who are now prisoners of war went to China, occupied China, some to Korea, and at least Bonnie's father to Japan. It's their story she's going to tell. And I'll introduce our other speaker. When Bonnie is done, she has 30 minutes, and then I'm supposed to get the hook. Bonnie.
Thank you, Joe. Tilt this a little bit. Thank you, Joe, and thanks to Colonel Don Patton, who invited me here tonight. And I'd also like to throw a thanks out to my colleague, Dr. Greg Irwin, who was originally slated for this evening's speech, but he had to cancel, and he recommended me in his stead, and I'll be grateful for that. Is there a way we can launch the slideshow, or I launch it?
Just advance to the next slide.
There we are. Wake Island, starring Wake Island right there. So I'll just plow through them that way. That'll work for me just fine. Wake Island obviously attacked the same day as Pearl Harbor, but it long remained a footnote, basically, in the massive Pearl Harbor library until a few decades ago, within the recent 2 or 3 decades, with the publication of a number of new books and also some documentary films. And the best of the books, in my estimation, are Greg Irwin's Facing Fearful Odds and Victory and Defeat. Again, most of these were, and virtually all of them, based or focused more on the military, valiant military defense of Wake Island, the Marines in particular, and rightfully so. My book, Building for War, takes a different angle, looks at it from a different perspective, that of the civilian contractors. These were Navy contractors who were sent there to build the base, and their story is fleshed out for me and my family, both my father and grandfather. Harry Olson, my grandfather, who would be the superintendent for all field work on Wake Island, and my father, Ted Olson, who was a lowly steel worker, college kid that just went to make a few bucks, that kind of thing. Turned out a little different for him. But that story really urged me to dig deeper, their story did, and to look into the pre-war Pacific strategies, the decision, why build a Navy air base on teeny tiny Wake Island? And that's what sort of moved me into the direction that I took. So as we know, Japanese did finally seize Wake on December 23rd, and all of the prisoners, civilian and military, were taken, the surviving defenders were taken prisoner of war for the duration of the war or for the duration of their lives, whichever came first. So as we move forward, I think we better take a look at where the heck Wake is. Out in the middle of the Pacific, it lies about 2,300 miles west of Hawaii, Oahu in particular. And you can see, I did draw a circle around it so you could see it. In my book, unfortunately, it gets buried in the gutter because it's right in the middle. It's a 2-page map. But there's Wake Island. And it's, I guess it's sort of telling that it gets buried in the gutter. But in any case, it is one of thousands of seamounts in the Pacific. These are just extinct volcanoes. This is the coral-encrusted top of an extinct volcano, and it has a fringing reef around it and then drops down 2 miles to the ocean floor, standing all by itself out there. The layout is, this is just a glancing look over the lagoon part of the atoll. The layout is the atoll is made up of 3 islets: Peel on the north, Peel Island on the north, Wake Island proper, which the V kind of points out to the east, and Wilkes Island on the south side. And so the lagoon in the middle opens out to the west, as if to welcome Japan. Go figure. I don't know. But it's maybe just less than 3 square miles total land space. Maximum elevation, whopping 20 feet. And that's just the peak of Wake Island, and the rest of it is about 1 to 2 feet above sea level. So the sea frequently washes over the shores of Wake Island. I was privileged to and honored to make a trip out there myself about 10 years ago at the invitation of the Air Force, and provide a historical tour for visiting generals and staff of the Pacific Command out there. So I was honored, like I say, very honored also to be able to be free to explore the atoll for several days and to take some pictures. And so I've included quite a few of the pictures in my slideshow here. Here are a few of them. This is looking, again, Wilkes is the south-facing, southwest aisle. So you can see over the shallow reef looking out to the blue, darker blue sea just beyond. Here's Wilkes looking the other direction, looking north in this case, across to the mountainous island of Peel, that 20-foot elevation right over there. You can see it. And then we have the reverse from Peel looking over to lowly Wilkes Island so this is right at the mouth of the lagoon here pretty much. But the beautiful turquoise color, you just can't imagine something that is that color. It's just gorgeous. The eastern shore of Wake Island, much rockier. The reef is closer into shore there. And here's the channel between Wake Island, where I'm standing here, and Peel Island on the other side. And you can see the ruins of, I'm showing you on my screen, but I guess you're looking up here, right? The ruins of a bridge that was built by the contractors, but is now nothing but ruins. It still is an interesting place to go. Pan Am is the start of Wake Island history, Pan American Airways. Wake Island was claimed in 1898, or annexed, I should say, claimed, I guess, but the surrounding reef doesn't allow anchorage for ships at all. There's no fresh water. So it was nothing but mere dot on the waste of waters, as one journalist phrased it. This was ignored, basically, until Pan Am in late 1934 requested leases on 3 outlying islands for its proposed Trans-Pacific Clipper route. It wanted to do, it was mainly an airmail contract. That was the bread and butter of the Pan Am idea. But this piqued the interest of the Navy in a big way because they were barred from fortifying outlying islands by treaty until the end of 1936. So Pan Am opened a back door to the Navy to start scouting around and doing some initial planning for what was lay ahead. Here I've drawn out the map, the Trans-Pacific Clipper route. Imagine with me, will you? San Francisco to Oahu, basically, Honolulu, to Midway Island, to Wake Island, to Guam, to Manila, and eventually to Hong Kong. I apologize for the slip. That won't happen again, I promise. The Navy immediately dispatched a ship, the USS Nitro, even before Pan Am got there, to scout out what was going to happen. And you can just barely see on the bottom here of this rock, this is the Nitro rock, the date of their departure, March 9th, 1935. So this is the oldest, a lot of other graffiti, but this is the oldest piece of evidence of human usage of Wake Island. So eventually, I got some slides about what went on here. Here comes Pan Am with their pioneer party, brought in equipment to build a naval air station on the mountainous island of Peel, which obviously was a good plan since that would alleviate them from flooding. But they had to channel it or move everything in at Wilkes, drag it through a shallow channel, and then get it across, a mile across the lagoon to the other side. So here they are doing that very thing. And Pan Am Clipper, you're probably familiar with what these are. This was a big flying machine here, and these were real soldiers of the, well, in a sense, of flying anyway. The Pan Am complex took shape on Peel, and they built a big long pier out into the lagoon so the planes could taxi up to it. They took off and landed in blasted runways through into the lagoon. And these paths led then to the hotel and other facilities around. Eventually, I should say, the first airmail flight took place in August 1935, and by 36, they'd built hotels, kind of fancy ones actually, prefab hotels on both Midway and Wake, so they were able to take paying passengers, which was really a fancy thing. It's hard to imagine this setting. This is the actual lobby on Wake Island, and otherwise this is just a barren, deserted island pretty much, but they had fun. This is an aerial, a Navy aerial of the Pan Am complex, and you can see the pier reaching out into the lagoon. It's now deserted, overgrown. That bridge burned down to Peel, and there's nothing there. So I took quite a few pictures, explored over there on that little catamaran, and just looked for the ruins of the beautiful big Pan Am buildings. They're all just swallowed up by overgrowth and so forth. This is the ruins of that pier that I showed you. This is the landing place where that pretty pergola was, and that's what's left of that. And the ramp on out into the lagoon. Pretty, but just not very functional anymore, understandably so. Deserted, nothing goes on Peel anymore. Pacific strategy is interesting in here, and I won't go into it too much, but we got two rising global powers, the United States and Japan, coming into the collision zone, basically, in the 30s in the Pacific. The United States had not only claimed Wake Island in 1898, it also annexed Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, and it won the colonies of the Philippines and Guam in the Spanish-American War. So 1898 was a hot year for the U.S. So having colonies that far distant out in the Pacific obligated the United States to protect them, which was going to make for trouble down the road. Japan's pre-war empire was also complicated out in the Pacific. It had acquired several island groups, the Marshalls, Carolines, and Marianas, as mandates right after World War I. And it was also forbidden from fortifying them by treaty, but they figured, the U.S. Navy figured they were doing it anyway. So they had a lot at stake around there. If you look at teeny tiny Wake right up there, the little blue dot above the Marshall Islands, that's 500 miles distance. That's the closest land to Wake Island, and it was definitely held by the Japanese. So there was a possibility of all kinds of things going there. By 1937, Japan was at war again with China, and as war heated up throughout, in Europe as well, by the late 1930s, Congress finally paid attention. This is a very isolationist atmosphere in Congress, and they decided to open the logjam, broke the logjam, and began increasing defense funding and the possibility for building up these outlying islands. Wake had defensive and offensive strategic value. It could potentially be help protect the defensive barrier of the Hawaiian Islands, as well as, if it came to it, launch offensive attacks against the Marshalls, the Japanese-held Marshalls. Likewise, it had extreme value for Japan in the same sense. The Wake project begins in January, the Navy Contractors anyway, begins in January of 1941. The Pioneer Party, including my grandfather, who's in the back row, I won't point him out, but he was a surprise to find this, it was a surprise to me to find this photograph in the National Archives. See him looking at me. They arrived January to begin building, had to build everything from scratch, from the ground up. They're not on Peel at this point, where the Pan Am facility is. They're building up the other parts of the island, but they had to bring everything in on barges, everything from cargo, because none of the ships could anchor, so everything had to come in and dragged across that shallow reef, including the workers who came to build up the workforce there. It was a busy place, all kinds of stuff going on here. Building that bridge, that's them building that bridge, that the ruins, we can still see those base foundations. Ultimately, hundreds of contractors came from 43 different states. They ranged in age from 17 to 69, so there were some old guys up there too. And they included, as I said before, my grandfather, Harry Olson, on your left, and Ted Olson, young fellow that he was, age 20, on the right there. There were several father and son pairs and some brothers and some cousins. And I also found six men from Minnesota in the roster, so I thought I'd show them here. We have pre-war pictures of just three of them. Ernest Groth is on your left, and George Ullman on the right, and Albert Steffes on the bottom. Those are their photographs. There was a carpenter, a couple of them were truck drivers, and a couple of clerks, but Minnesota was well represented on Wake. Most of the guys were from the West Coast, though, California and the West Coast area. They built the camps. It took them 6 months to build just the camps to live in, to distill enough seawater to feed water the workers, I guess you'd say. They built a mess hall that could seat 1,000, and it ultimately did by the time December rolled around. And just lots of activity. They did build a bridge to Peel, and Peel was where ultimately the naval, the permanent facilities of the Naval Air Station were going to be located, and they would start in on those later. The main project for the Naval Air Base was cutting a useful ship channel into that lagoon. Since you couldn't dock a ship at all on the reef anywhere, it's so shallow and so rugged, They needed to get a channel into the lagoon and dredge into the lagoon. They also wanted to build a submarine base. But the Navy couldn't decide on where to carve the channel. There was a big debate between contractors and Navy, and delays and delays and delays. So it was a difficult experience, and that channel would make its existence or non-existence would be the difference between Wake as a liability or viable in December of 1941. The Marines began to arrive in the summer of 1941 to begin the fortification of Wake as planned. Fortifying an island just 500 miles north of the Marshalls was a risk, but SINCPAC Admiral Husband Kimmel argued that it might well prove a really key strategy. Wake itself, a fortified Wake, could be the bait that lured the Navy, Japanese Navy, out of the Marshall Islands and exposed it to U.S. Navy forces, or at least allowed the Navy, our Navy, to assess their capabilities. So there was a lot of thought and planning going into the fortification of Wake Island. Ultimately, his vision was for 2,500 Marines and sailors and 4 squadrons of planes, bombers, and fighters and everything, and there would only be a fraction of that by December of 41. Japan invaded Indochina second time in summer of 45, or 41, excuse me, which changed some of the strategy out there. Army General Douglas MacArthur argued that we could fly a fleet of B-17s out there and land them right on Japan's doorstep, and wouldn't that be a intimidating factor? So sudden orders came through on Wake Island to expand land runways, and for the Marines then to become gas station attendants, basically refilling those westbound B-17s by hand on the runways. So it was going to be a hunk of work, no doubt about it. On the eve of war, Wake was just churning with activity. There were guns, batteries being set up and work done and dredging and all kinds of stuff going on. Pan Am clippers were kept aloft and in and out, and the civilians in particular figured no danger, no sweat. Uncle Sam will take care of us. We've been promised. Uncle Sam will take care of us. So that was the faith that was sustaining them. As it turned out, my grandfather was not taken, ultimately, spoiler alert, not taken prisoner. He was, as a supervisor or superintendent, he was allowed to take occasional vacations. And on December 4th, a seat opened up on the eastbound China Clipper. So he took it and went to Honolulu for what he thought was going to just be a short stay with no expectation that he wouldn't be returning in a week. This is his sort of tongue-in-cheek certificate from Pan Am for crossing the international date line, which was marked the difference in dates between Wake Island and the states and Hawaii. So the domain of Phoebus Apollo. And this was common with ships as well. They always made a big deal about crossing the date line. So, but his H.B. Olson, that's my grandfather, and it's signed by the captain of the China Clipper. And that was a big deal. And that stayed in our, I guess, in the box of memorabilia for a long, long time. Unbeknownst to those passengers on that ship, the carrier Enterprise was delivering 12 Grumman fighters to Wake Island. The Wildcats would be Wake's own Air Force. So that very day, 12 F-4, F-3 Grumman Wildcats were flying over to Wake and landing there one after another on the runway. Happy day. I guess I could show you a picture of them. You probably already know what a picture of a Wildcat looks like. But this was a big deal. They were. This was going to be a real addition to the Marine Fighting Force. This is VMF 211, and away they came. The project, however, was only 60% complete. The channel, a little more than half dug through Wilkes Island, where they finally decided to do it, the Navy ship channel. The Marine ground forces were insufficient to man all the guns, and the promised radar had not arrived. And that's the standing as of the day of the attack. The attack began on Wake just a few minutes short of noon on December 8th, same day as Pearl Harbor, December 7th, across the date line. And it was actually 27 bombers descended out of a cloud bank and came in over Wake in 3 waves, one going over the airfield, one over the Contractors camp, and one over the Pan Am base on Peel, and bombing and strafing as they went. This just only lasted just a few minutes total. But at the airfield, 7 of the 8 Wildcats sitting on the ground were destroyed, utterly destroyed. Fuel dumps were burning. 30 Marines died right there, right then and there. 4 other Wildcats were aloft on morning patrol. They were above the cloud cover and had not seen the incoming Japanese bombers. That wouldn't happen again. At Pan Am, the hotel was set afire. 10 Pan Am employees burned in that first fire. So the Philippine Clipper happened to be at dock, had been recalled and returned to the dock, and it was shot up, but still airworthy. So they stripped it down really fast, and they loaded all the American Pan Am station personnel on it, and 3 takeoff attempts on the lagoon, but they were able to get off for a very perilous flight to Honolulu. And meanwhile, the Marines were at their gun batteries. Everybody was carrying wounded and dead, putting out fires. There was just a scramble. Nobody could stay in barracks anymore. Those had been bombed up. So dragging mattresses out, trying to figure out, dig dugouts, everything. It was a situation they didn't know, they had no idea what was coming next. If it was right around the corner, if it was the one and only attack, no clue. So they did settle in for the duration. The big gun batteries on Wake's points. I'll show you a map in just a minute. This is the only remaining gun, this is a 3-inch gun that was found after the war, and it had been stripped of all its firing mechanisms and everything, but it's on display in Wake Island now, on Wake Island. Here's a map showing the kind of the basic outline of the defenses on Wake. You can see the gun batteries on the 3 points. It's about 8 miles point to point all the way around if you drove the road. The batteries were 5-inch guns and 3-inch guns. There were also other fortifications. You can see the Pan Am facilities on Peel Island there, the Contractors camp, Camp 2 on the northwest side of Wake Island, the east-west runway that runs along the South Beach, and Wilkes Island over there with some more fortifications. This was what the Japanese bombers were looking at too, and they were targeting every day for 16 days. They came back. On day 4, the defenders repelled a land invasion. This was a great moment. They realized that instead of bombers coming overhead, they had ships coming in towards them, and the Marine Major James Devereaux, ordered hold fire. So they were being bombed, nothing was really hitting anybody, but they held fire till the ships were about, 4,500 yards offshore, and then they opened up, and they hit them bad. And as soon as John Light showed, the 4 remaining Wildcats were aloft chasing them. Ultimately, 2 destroyers were sunk in a submarine, and 4 ships badly damaged. Over 500 Japanese died in that attack, and not one single person died on Wake Island that day. But the Japanese did come back again and again, and ultimately the 4 high explosive magazines on Wake Island were turned into field hospitals and 2 command posts, one for the Major Devereaux and one for the Navy Commander Winfield Scott Cunningham. So these are a few of the bunker pictures that I took. These are just concrete bunkers, but they served a purpose. There weren't very many places to hide on Wake Island. The final invasion occurred on December 23rd in the dark of night, a dark and stormy night, and it occurred on the south beach of Wake Island, the exposed beach. Probably 800 or 900 SNLF Japanese forces were brought ashore or grounded in landing craft on the south shore and stormed ashore. And the defenses were enormous, but after 11 hours of fighting, that was all they were able to do, and they ended up surrendering. There was no contingency plan for the contractors and for them being captured at all, and they would end up, or the Navy would end up forming the construction battalions, the Seabees, as a result of this in January of 42. During the, I'll be brief now, I think I'm running out of time, but as one of the heroic defenders of Wake Island, Captain Hank Elrod was awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for his work. All of the civilians and military alike were taken prisoner of war for the rest of the war, those who had survived anyway, except some remained on Wake Island. These guys are en route to the Hell Ship, taking them to prison camps. During the war, Japan built up Wake Island for its forces, and this shows a dauntless bomber over Wake in October of 43 in a massive attack that dropped 1,000 tons of explosives on Wake Island. This is an aerial showing some of the damage that was done and recorded by them. 98 prisoners were still on Wake Island, and as a result of this air raid, the Japanese commander of the island ordered their massacre. They were lined up on the north shore of Wake Island, blindfolded and machine gunned to death. So that's an important message for all of us who remain behind to honor their memory. Quickly, I'll go through a couple of slides of my father's prisoner of war camp in Uwata, where he was the majority of the war, working for the Uwata Steel Works. This shows some of the effects of malnutrition and disease on the prisoners in that camp. It's amazing that this man got pictures out at all. The end of the war comes finally in August of 45, and only ruins remain now. Japan, of course, surrendered Wake Island to the Americans, and a number of ruins remain. The command post, here's some of the fortifications, some pillboxes still sitting, and they get moved around by the sea, but they're still there. Altogether, 250 contractors died in the war, 74 military, and of all those, oh yes, this is the 8-inch gun of the Japanese on Peel, and there's 178 who died on Wake and whose bones were commingled there are reburied now in Punchbowl Cemetery, where we can honor them. We can honor them to this day. Survivors groups were formed, both military and civilian. The survivors were awarded Navy discharges and veterans benefits in 1981, which was a real boon for them. It was my honor to share my experience with them and photos from my trip. This is me and the generals, me and the gens. So today, the bridge to Peel is gone, and only the gaping scar of the unfinished ship channel stands to remind us the difference between Wake's ability to fight back and not. Here's another picture, close-up of it. And seabirds Hundreds of thousands of them nest on Wake Island today, as they did always before and always will until the sea rises and swallows Wake up. That's all I got. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonnie. I hate to be the executioner who cuts off good talks. Our second speaker is Linda Brown. She's the daughter of Irv Silverlieb, who was a Marine who was stationed on Wake Island as part of the 1st Base Defense Battalion. They, of course, got to welcome the Japanese with a little bit more vigor than the contractors, who didn't have heavy artillery. Like the contractors, the Marines became prisoners of war, though both the two groups were separated and by the Japanese. So Irv got sent to occupied China, then to scenic Korea, and finally to a coal mine in Japan. After the war, he spent quite a bit of time in hospitals before being discharged to marry his sweetheart, the result of which is Linda, who will be telling us about Irv's stories. And so welcome, Linda Brown. Linda.
Can you see me behind the podium? I'm one of those people who are going down instead of up. So, as you was mentioned, I'm here to talk about my dad, Irving Silverlieb. First, I'll tell you some facts, and then I'll get into some of his stories and some of his experiences. Well, he was born in Danzig, North Dakota, to parents of Russian immigrants, and they eventually arrived in Minneapolis, where he grew up and went to all through school there in Minneapolis as well. Now, one thing I just learned about my dad is that he joined the National Guard at ages between 14 and 15. Don't know how that happened, but that's what I read. And then joined the Marines at age 17. Now, it was during the Depression, and, you know, one of the money was hard to come by. His parents were very, very poor, and he had 5 sisters that were still living at home. His dad was not one of my favorite people, not a nice guy, and I think that even though he wanted to join the service, they did let him go again at age 17. And he went to training and then became, of course, a sergeant and a gunner. Left the service as a staff sergeant. He was assigned, as mentioned, to the 1st Defense Battalion. And he was quite a guy, really. Some of his experiences really transferred into the person that he became. And I think it took me long into my adulthood to fully understand why he became the person that he did. Starting like when he got home, well, first of all, after he went into the Marines, he probably weighed about maybe 160, 170 pounds. He was 5'10". When he got home, when he left prison camp, he weighed 87 pounds. Quite a difference there. One thing that I found really interesting too is that his parents first got the telegram that he was wounded in action. Then they got a telegram saying that he had been killed. And I guess the Japanese allowed them to write a letter like several months in. And when they got the letter, they didn't believe that it came from him. They actually had a funeral for him. And I have the obituary somewhere. And when they got word that he was alive and in the hospital, they still didn't believe it, that it was him, because they thought they were just, playing mind games with them, that it just wasn't true. So his arrival home was quite a surprise to everyone. Pretty interesting. With his experiences in prison camp, what I would like to do is kind of relate again how his experiences transferred into his life and how it affected our family. So, as we mentioned, when he was captured, they were captured on Wake on the 24th of December, and boarded ships that took them to China. And it was an absolutely horrific experience being on the boat. Crowded conditions. Of course, by this time they were already starving because they were waiting. Well, they were waiting for the ships. They were, kept with their hands tied. There had been the bombing, so their clothes were all torn and everything. So they really had no protection at all. The food that they were given was, minimal at best. And when they got to the prison camp, they had to, first of all, they were loaded on trains taken to the prison camp, and you can only imagine how horrible the conditions on the trains were after being on those ships for so long. Then they were forced to march to the prison camps. And conditions, were not ideal by any circumstance. Well, one thing that I learned that is that the average soldier at the camps more or less respected them because they put up a battle. But the big guys, they, thought, no way. They just did not respect them. They did not treat them well. And that's putting it mildly. They were beaten. They were assaulted. One of the things that was a frequent occurrence in many of the camps was the soldiers would do something to provoke them. Everything from beheading somebody in front of them, which happened on occasion, shooting somebody, taking one of the prisoners and beheading them or doing something worse. And if the soldiers reacted in any kind of way, they became the next victim. So they were trained by their COs to, not react, do not show any emotion at all. And translating that to his later life, and as a parent, he did not show emotion at all. He did not show affection at all. It was, and I really believe that was due to the conditioning that he had to endure. You don't show emotion, and you don't suddenly come home after almost 5 years and become that person who can show emotion, who can feel, because you were denied being a human being. In the Japanese culture, the worst possible thing you can do, especially if you were a soldier, was to surrender. And if you were a surrender, you were a dog. I mean, you were nothing. And because you were nothing, that's how they treated you. And starvation, they were given, what they called soup, which was basically water with some rice, and lots of bugs, maybe some worms, but you ate what you had to eat. And the soldiers, in their group, supported each other. So if one became weak, you shared your food. You just supported them any way that you could. And that translated to my life. When we were growing up, and all through his life, we were never hungry. The refrigerator was always full. The freezer was always full. I mean, my parents would go to the store every single week, and spending a couple $100 on food was not, abnormal. It was, we have to have food. It was, I will never be hungry again. And he wasn't, and he made sure his kids were never hungry again. And like I said, it took a while for me to put two and two together with that. Another thing that really kind of brought an awareness to my life later on is when he was home after during the 50s and 60s, there were a lot of war shows on TV. I remember Combat and Hogan's Heroes. And I couldn't understand why he wanted to watch these programs. And then it occurred to me that, okay, for all those years that he was told that he was a coward because he surrendered, well, on these shows, the Americans always won. They were the smart guys. So he was fighting the war through these shows. And the effect that I got was it just made me angry, especially Hogan's Heroes. I don't know how many of you remember that show, but it was a German prisoner of war camp. The German soldiers were portrayed as fools, as idiots, as people you could pull anything over on. We're building this tunnel, and yeah, you don't know about it. We've got all this equipment, but the Germans don't know about it. And, they were idiots. And, they tried to make it funny, and I kept thinking, this isn't funny. War isn't funny. People get tortured, people get killed, people get maimed, people starve. There's no humor in that. And as I was growing up, it just kind of fed into me, and I started to, I blamed the military. I blamed the Japanese. I blamed as many people as I could, and it manifested to me in a way, that I became, very, very anti-war, and became an anti-war activist during the Vietnam War, and initially my dad didn't quite agree with me on that, but towards the end he kind of ended up agreeing with me. But getting back to prison camps, medical facilities, again, weren't the best. So about 4 months into him being at the first camp, he had an appendix attack, and he had to have surgery. You know how it was done? It was done with razor blades, and not in a hospital, no sanitary conditions. The anesthesia that he had were other soldiers holding him down. He passed out, and that's how they were able to complete the surgery. I guess the Japanese wanted to move him to one of their hospital, and there was an American doctor who happened to be a prisoner, and they said, no, we'll keep him here and just give us what we need. So they gave him the 5 razor blades to do the surgery with, and somehow he survived. I just can't imagine that. Then, he ended up with, every disease under the sun, everything from malaria to beriberi. When he was forced to work in the coal mines at the prison camp in Hakodate, I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, they did not have any kind of protective clothing at all. They were in there barefoot and, just wearing the Japanese clothing that they were given. They had no personal effects of their own. Everything was taken from them. They were working in like knee-deep water, no power tools. They had to use their hands to dig for coal. It had been a coal mine that had been formerly closed, but they reopened it just so they could have the slave labor and have the workers doing something. And again, it was just a perilous situation. I mean, can you imagine? It was so cold down there. Well, my dad ended up with lifelong problems with his legs. When he got home to the first base, he first went to Guam and then to Great Lakes Medical Center. His bones were so fragile, they had to staple them together so he could move. He ended up having, I think, close to 5 or 6 different knee surgeries. One time, during one of his surgeries, he was having surgery on both legs at the same time. He was dreaming. Of course, nightmares were frequent, long, into his life. He was dreaming that he was trying to escape from prison camp. They actually found him sleepwalking after the day of surgery down the hall, and they had to, bring him back to his bed. And I just, again, can't imagine, how he even survived that. But, again, and he was just in constant pain all of his life, but he never complained. I don't have very good thoughts about the VA, especially when the prisoners got home, including my dad. They were not treated very well. In fact, they were treated quite badly. They didn't know what to do with them. And of course, PTSD was something that hadn't been heard of yet or, discussed. And the men who complained that they were treated badly were threatened with, hey, you complained, you're going to lose your pension. Just about all of the POWs that were returned ended up with 100% disability. Now, what's really interesting is that at the beginning, when my dad got home, he complained that his kidneys were bothering him. So they, said, well, drink lots of water, and we'll get rid of those kidney stones. Well, years later, my dad ended up with kidney failure and on dialysis for the last 6 years of his life. And he didn't like that. I mean, I remember them coming home with, blood dripping from his arm. They finally started providing some psychiatric care, and I went with him a couple times to some of his appointments. And, I think it did help him. Now, the other thing that happened is that a lot of the prisoners, especially like from this area, had a group that met regularly. And they supported themselves. I mean, once you're a prisoner or in that situation, you're bonded for life. And, they all had their complaints about the way that they had been treated. And, it took a long time for things to start to get right. But, boy, there were so many times when they weren't. And for some reason, again, which I never understood, after they started, really providing somewhat better care, my dad insisted on going to the VA. Well, one night, I can't remember exactly what was going on. He wanted to go to the VA emergency room, and he literally laid on a cold gurney without a blanket for several hours while they tried to, find somebody. Now, we lived like a couple miles from Methodist Hospital. No, he wouldn't go there. He had to go to the VA. And it got, got me really angry that he insisted on doing that. But there's just like so many things that I remember. And when I think about it, I get even worse. The thing too that's really interesting, when I was asked to do this, I thought, how am I going to talk about my dad for half hour, 20 minutes? I thought, well, then I started thinking, and then I started realizing that that there was a whole lot to say about him. And I just find it interesting. Another one of those things that became as a result of his experience was he was a workaholic. Now, they didn't have that term, back then, but because he was forced to work, 14 to 16 hours a day in the coal mines, he attributed his, what he called his work ethic to being a POW. Well, how that translated to our family was we never had a vacation. Never. Not once. The whole time that I was growing up, we did not have a vacation, except for the one day that we drove to Duluth. Couldn't find a hotel. They drove over the border into Canada, and for some reason it was getting late or they couldn't find a room. We drove back to St. Louis Park. So that was the experience for my vacation. So I'd go to, you go to school and after summer vacation, and everybody were talking about what they did on summer vacation. Nothing. Where'd you go? Nowhere. I mean, Saturday through Sunday was his day off, and then of course it's your day off, so you don't do anything except sit and relax. It's and I think back about those things, and I want to place blame on somebody. I want to place it on the military. I want to place it on the POWs, or the soldiers, the Japanese. But again, what's interesting about him and my mom is they went back to Japan twice. They went to China, and I know that people asked him, well, how could you do that? Don't you hate them for what they did to you? And he said, no. He recognized the fact that, they were just the common people doing their job. But, he was real forgiving. I mean, they came back with lots of souvenirs and all kinds of things. And, you know, like I said, they went back twice. Went to Australia a couple times. Of course, this was all after my dad retired, you know. I wasn't able to benefit from any of these trips, which is another thing I really resented. They took my son, but they never took me, which, you know, typical grandparents, right? Of course, my dad also let my son drive his car when he was 13, but that's another whole story. But, yeah. Let's see, just check through. Oh, I gotta tell you another story. One time, a woman came to interview him, and this was when he was, I think, in his 80s. He was like probably 81, 82. And the woman said, "So, Irving, being a prisoner of war, what was it like?" And he says, "Oh, it wasn't so bad." And I said, "Dad, it was awful. How can you possibly say that?" "No, it wasn't so bad, Dad." But yeah, he was quite the character. And you know, the one thing that a couple things. I never sat down and talked to him about his experiences and what it meant to him. I mean, sure, I played the chauffeur, you know, going back and forth to the VA and listened to those stories that we shared on occasion. But I never really sat down and said, you know, let's talk, you know, because you know, so many of the POWs didn't want to share their stories. And I can sure understand why now. But I guess my biggest regret was I never told him that, you know, that he was my hero, that, you know, I understood where he was coming from. You know, I understood why he was not affectionate. I understand, you know, your lack of emotion. But it really took a long time for me to come to that, you know, that realization that his life experience, you know, became our family's experience. My brother Steve, really good guy. He, you know, was of age and during Vietnam. And, you know, here I'm doing draft counseling in New York, helping people get out or now avoid the draft. And I'm sending letters to Steve. This is what you do. Well, you know, my dad guilt tripped him into joining. Well, he had so many health problems, including hearing problems, that he never should have been accepted. He should have been 4F like right away. But he did end up going down to training in Texas, where both of his eardrums were blown out. And when he got home, my dad, you know, came to the realization that, you know, that this isn't right, that Steve, you know, shouldn't have joined. Well, my dad, you know, the other side effect of his experience was he buried his pain in the bottle. And at one point, he was drinking, he said, anywhere from a pint to a fifth every single day. And, you know, I never saw him as a drunk, but I guess he told my brother, who also took out his pain in the bottle and every drug under the sun, that if you stop, I'll stop. And he did. My brother went to treatment at St. Mary's, and my dad just stopped, except for, the occasional drink with friends on, especially the group of POWs. So that was a real accomplishment for him to do that. But he realized, that he was not only hurting himself, but he was hurting, his family as well. But, yeah, I really loved him. And towards the end of his life, he just really mellowed. And, then I got the hugs and, and the, I loved you. And I remember so distinctly when he was starting to, get early dementia. And he said, well, why don't you just, put me in a nursing home or something? I'm just a pain in the ass. And I said, Dad, I'd rather have you here as a pain in an ass than, being in one of those, a nursing home. But he just, he was getting so tired of the dialysis and, everything else that he was going through. And I think, in the end, I think he just kind of gave up. He ended up with heart problems as well as aortic stenosis. I don't know if I can contribute that to his experience as a POW, but shortly before, in fact, the day before he died, one of the visiting nurses came to our home and said, Irving, you're doing so well, I think that I'm going to have to, come less often to see you. And the next day he died. But I miss him terribly, and wish he were here, and I wish that I said all the things that I, wanted to say, that I, think about now. I wish that I had asked him the questions that I want answers to. It's really, in a sense, very strange that I had to learn more about my dad reading an interview that he did in 2003 than I did growing up with him. And I think that's all that I can share with you.
So are there any questions?
So he surrendered to Japan and ended up in China? I'm confused.
They were transferred to 3 different locations. So they started out, I think, in, let me check.
It's Shanghai War Prisoners Camp. It was occupied China.
Yeah. And
That's where they were initially taken. Yeah. Wusong.
And then,
In Japanese occupied China.
right. And then they were in Korea and in Japan. So 3 different places. And each time they moved, the conditions and got worse and worse, especially with the food. The water got even worse than it was before, less, rice or whatever it was that they were putting in. I think probably more bugs than anything else. So it was just really, really horrible. Like I said, his condition was so bad when he got home that his legs were so fragile that they literally had to staple them together. Go ahead, Chris.
How long could they have lasted on Wake Island with food? Or I should say, what was the remaining food supply when they surrendered?
The food supply was actually fairly generous when they left. There were 1,200 contractors there, 500 Marines, 70 Navy, and food supplies were pretty substantial. They'd been doing this for a year, so they had a good storage of food. When the Japanese took over 1,000 of them off the island in early January of 42, there were left maybe 365 prisoners, and there was a lot of American food left by the time those 98 were massacred, as I told you about. That was October of 43. There was still sufficient combo, American food and, supplement from, they were not starved on Japan until, or on Wake Island. But after that devastating bombing in October, the Americans returned again and again, and it essentially blockaded Japan, so Japan itself was not resupplied, and hundreds of Japanese soldiers died from starvation on Wake at that point.
Question for Bonnie.
Yes, sir.
If the Japanese bombers had been spotted by those American patrols on December 8th, would it have made much of a difference?
Probably not, because they were not fully armed for combat. They were just doing a patrol. They didn't, they knew, they had found out about Pearl Harbor that morning. They got the news of that. So it was just kind of a scouting, but they were not, especially against 27 Mitsubishi bombers. No, they probably would have been shot down as well. It's my estimation. What if? Say again?
Thank you. I had a question for Bonnie. I don't think we really heard what happened to your father and grandfather towards the end of the war.
Yeah, I kind of went fast over the end.
Sure.
My grandfather was in Pearl Harbor when it was attacked, and he ended up working out of the contractors had a large operating base there. So he worked raising the sunken battleships or stricken battleships anyway, and he ended up never going back. Well, obviously nobody went back to Wake, but he obviously survived the war. My father did as well. Again, similar to Linda's father, he was diseased and harmed by the war in a terrible way, but actually his prison camp was in Uwata, close to Kokura, and if we're all familiar with Nagasaki, that was choice number 2 for the second atomic bomb. The first choice was the area where my father was employed, or not employed, he was working as slave labor in the Uwata steelworks. And except for a haze and a faulty fuel pump, I wouldn't be sitting here today. So, yeah.
Thank you, Bonnie and Linda.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.